many parts of the world. I took a note of where people had signed in from yesterday. I didn't get everybody, but I think we have representatives from at least 19 different countries and across a lot of Australia. So we're really delighted that there's been good participation. And Anna's just showing the map now of where people have dialed in from, or at least put their pins. And so you can see there's quite a nice wide distribution, including right in the middle of the Pacific. And a lot of attendees from India and through China and across the Asia Pacific, but also from the Americas, which is really, really satisfying to see. And so welcome to you all. And we always intended this to be a platform for inclusion and allow people the opportunity who may not be able to travel great distances because of lack of funding or whatever, to have a chance to participate. And so in some ways, the virtual forum has allowed a greater advantage perhaps for making new connections and hearing exciting science from different parts of the world. So today we've got another full program. We're going to start with our invited speaker, Dr. Mary Voytek, with her colleagues from the NASA Astrobiology Institute in America. And then later in the morning, have a session on the hot springs as a setting for the origin of life, with a few contributed talks. Then our midday break and into the next session on modern analogs for primitive life, and then into a session on messy chemistry and the origin of life with an invited talk by Dr. Sudha Rajamani at 2 o'clock. So without any further delay, I'd like to very much introduce our invited speaker, Dr. Mary Voytek. She took charge of NASA's astrobiology program in 2008. And her primary research interest is in aquatic microbial ecology and biochemistry. And she has worked in extreme environments, including in Antarctica, in hypersaline lakes, and in deep sea hydrothermal vents. In 2018, she was appointed as the executive director of ELSI, and she was a major reason for helping to get our AAM going. And I wanted to thank her for her support in terms of having the meeting, which was going to be held at ELSI in Tokyo. Although that hasn't turned out, it's still great to have that support. And we're really delighted to have Mary give us the first invited talk for today, together with colleagues Daniella Scalice and Melissa Kirven-Brooks. So Mary, if you want to unmute and share your slides, welcome.
Okay. Oh boy, okay. So it doesn't look like it's letting me share my screen. Well, that's a bummer. I should have checked this. Let's see.
It's totally fine. It might be a permissions window hidden behind the Zoom window.
There we go. Yep, I think it came up. All right, let's see if it lets me do it now. Yes. All right, excellent. Okay, I'm going to do that one. Share. And
You can almost always tell who's a Mac user because this happens to every Mac user.
well, and just so that you know, NASA told us we weren't allowed to use Zoom, and so they come in regularly and remove the app from my computer. So anyway, thank you for your patience. I'm sorry it took that a little bit of time to get through that technical hiccup. Today I'm going to talk to you from my job as the senior scientist for astrobiology at NASA headquarters. And I wanted to talk about meeting astrobiology's challenges for the future. And I purposely put a question mark at the end of this title to let you know that I have ideas of things that I think we need to be thinking about. In some places I have some suggestions about what we might do. But as we move into some of the other aspects of it, not just the science, you know, it's really important, and we've structured this so we have time to talk about the science, what we need for our future workforce, and what we need in terms of education and reaching a global community, because we as astrobiologists, of course, work on what I think is one of the most important fields of study. And I always say to people, I think everyone is an astrobiologist, because you're trying to understand the origin, evolution, and the distribution of life in the universe. And we need to know everything about our environment, the environments beyond our planet, everything about how life emerged and evolved here on Earth, what kind of biospheres we have, what are the organisms that inhabit that, in order to answer these really important questions. So today I'm mostly, particularly since of what's on the agenda for the rest of the meeting today, I'm going to talk mostly about the last quest of an astrobiologist, which is understanding the distribution of life in the universe. And I'm going to start out by saying one of the biggest challenges in all of this is how we define life. In general, we understand that the thing on the left is a rock and is not alive, and the thing on the right is a cow and it is alive. And then there are things in the middle, and that picture in the middle under my defining life is actually a prion. You know, are those living? It's up for debate. Where is that borderline? When does that, when do things switch from biotic to abiotic? And in the end, how do we understand that or define it? And I've given you just, if you ask anyone or you go online and ask what is life, you get millions of hits. And if you're in a room of scientists of 100 people, you'll get at least 110 definitions of what life is. It's some version of being chemistry with some kind of history or memory. There's the NASA definition of life as a self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution. But in the end, when you're thinking about searching for life, how do you develop a functional definition that will help you detect it? I remember as an undergrad having lots of philosophical discussions about what life was. But when it comes to building instruments, flying them on missions, and looking at other environments, how do we define what we need to look for? And we've had a fair number of decades now to think about certainly defining life as we know it. But there's also this idea of coming up with biosignatures that aren't specific to life as we don't know it at all, or even life as we know it, but we don't know how to recognize a particular solution. So life, some of the definitions of life often focus on things that have to do with specifics of the chemistry, of the solvent it uses. And so I've taken this definition from the Weird Life report from 2007 about how to define what Terran life seems to need. It needs water as a solvent. Is that the only solvent it can use? We don't know. And there's a list of 4 different things that are pretty specific to the solution that life on Earth has found. And then there was a recent paper that came out by Bartlett and Wong just earlier this year, looking at life, or however you pronounce it, which tries to make it more of a universal definition and look for features that are less interested in the exact solution, and I would argue would be more agnostic. So life does not exist at equilibrium, so you look for dissipation, you look for autocatalysis, and that could be some expression of exponential growth of some representative measure. Homeostasis, it maintains some key internal variables within ranges that there is an ideal set point for. And it's capable of learning, and that can be recording information from external and internal environments, processing that information, carrying out actions and reactions, and evidence of some positive feedback on its probability of surviving and proliferating. And so learning is a key to that. And again, what the actual solutions are in terms of the chemistry or the structure is left to a range of possibilities, but you're looking for these other fundamental features. And that helps us to look for life as we don't know it, and as well as I said, life when we don't exactly know what the solution is, particularly in environments that are foreign to us. The other things that I think are really important or another challenge to us is understanding what we need to consider when we actually go to employ a biosignature or a set of biosignatures in a mission setting, when we want, whether it's a mission to early Earth to try to find examples of life in old rock, or to another planet. And I think these are some interesting features that I think are actually essential for us to consider. And this came from a presentation by Vicki Meadows at a Biosignatures for Exoplanet workshop. And I think it applies to any biosignature. We need to make sure that it's reliable. Could it be produced by life? Is it less likely to be produced by planetary processes such as geology and photochemistry? And this is always a test we put to any proposed biosignature. How well does it survive? Does it avoid the normal sinks in a planetary atmosphere? Again, this was for exoplanets. Destruction by photochemistry, reactions with volcanic gases, reactions with the surface, dissolving in an ocean. And this is referring to a biosignature in the atmosphere. But similar constraints could be put on the evaluation of survivability of a biosignature that would be on the surface. Also, how easy is it to detect? Again, do we have the proper instrumentation? What are the limits of the detection? What is the minimum sample size or signal size you would need to be able to detect this? In the case of exoplanets, again, they're looking at spectra. Is there competing measures that would either give a false positive or obscure and give a false negative? These are all things that you have to consider. And I think the most important of all things on this slide is context matters. So something that seems like a perfectly reasonable biosignature could be great for in a particular environment, but you add the complication of oxidizing compounds, and suddenly the survivability of a particular biosignature, particularly if it's an organic, goes way down. How do you interpret life from non-life in the context of the environment in which you find it? And I have a quote from Vicki that I really like to use, which is, our best strategy in all of this is to understand the environments that we're investigating or interrogating, predict what it would look like with no life. So start with kind of a null hypothesis of what would this planet look like in terms of geology, chemistry, atmospheric signals, whatever. What does that look like without life? And then look for disturbance in the force. Look for something unexpected, and that's the place you start if you want to try to look for the effects of biology on a system. So to me, these are our big challenges, and they're big challenges because there are so many missions that are being planned that I'm going to talk about in a second, to go look at places within our own solar system and of course exoplanets beyond. And so knowing what we need to look for so that we can develop the right instrumentation, and in most cases it's going to be a suite of instruments that's going to give us the answer that we need, or a suite of measurements that we can make, is really important as we face the next decade or two of really exciting space missions that many nations around the world have planned. But I want to say something too about when we think about places to look. Now, it's always been the mantra of NASA to follow the water. And it turns out, I love this image. It's from an artist's image of the most distant reservoir of water. This is from AAM2020 plus 5255, which is a black hole quasar. It harbors, or quasar that harbors a black hole. It was detected a few years ago. This is what the detection looked like. And one of the things that the scientists using the Chandra X-ray imaging of this quasar found was that it contains 140 trillion times all the water in the world's ocean. And this is phenomenal, that you could find something so far away and a massive amount of water. We also see tons of water in the Milky Way. Water is not a shortage. And while it's an important thing for life as we know it, and it's always a good start, that isn't everything that we need to know, knowing that water everywhere, but is life only existing on Earth? What else are we challenged with understanding about what life needs? I love when people come to me and say, oh, you know, we're studying this, comet or asteroid, and it's got lots of water, so it could harbor life. And I remind them that that's not all life needs. The ingredients of life are certainly water at the top, but it needs energy and it needs schnapps. And if you can't show me that there's plenty of nitrogen and phosphorus and sulfur available, then I'm not thinking that that world is habitable. And I've been starting to tell people to think, if you melted this body, or you brought back a liquid sample of, say, Ceres or a watery world in our own solar system, could I inoculate that with a microorganism from Earth, and would it grow? If that happens, then that's a habitable environment. Otherwise, I'm not so sure that that we should be so cavalier with calling places potentially habitable. So my challenge to people, particularly planetary scientists, is when you come to me with a candidate that we should go looking for life, make sure you realize that it's not just water that we need. We need a reasonable source of energy that we understand can be used by organisms. We need all of the building blocks or the elements, including, you know, metals for proteins and reaction centers. And so it's not just simply finding water. So I'm going to talk a little bit in my remaining time about places that we're going and missions that we have, so you can think about that as well. We're certainly going to our nearest neighbor, where there's plenty of evidence of water in the past, and a suspicion that in the early history of Mars, it had maybe more water than we even have on our planet as a percentage of or volume of the water on Mars, and it lost it through atmospheric loss potentially. So of course there's water there. We think it's a good place to look. And we have a number of missions that we ourselves at NASA have on the planet, have flown in the past, have landed in the past, and have operating now, including Perseverance, which I'm guessing that Mitch told you about yesterday. There are two other missions from China and the United Arab Emirates that were also launched this summer. So we have at least 3 nations up there looking for more information and finding out more, or making more measurements to characterize the habitability, so we can understand the likelihood or the possibility of life on Mars. We also have the ocean worlds. I've just noted the icy satellites, and this is their relative size as compared to the Earth. And the amazing thing about it, again, I've told you not to just look at water, we need to look at other things. But why do we find these interesting? It's because if you compared the amount of water in those ice-covered moons that I showed you, it would be something like 60 times the amount of water on Earth, even though their sizes are so small. So again, looking for the water, we find the water, and we're interested in learning more about these worlds. And we have a number of missions that are coming up. There's the NASA Europa flyby mission that's going to characterize the surface, make estimates about the thickness of the ice shelf, and perhaps something about the chemistry of the ocean below. We're hoping it'll launch in 2024 and arrive sometime in 2030 to better characterize this really promising world in our outer solar system. In addition, there's ESA JUICE, the Jupiter Icy Moons Explorer. It's going to look at Ganymede, Callisto, and Europa. That's due to launch May 2022. Excuse me, arriving at Jupiter in 2029, and spend 3 years investigating Jupiter and its moons. And then the US also has a mission that that's in development to investigate the only other body in our solar system that has a liquid on the surface, which is Titan. So Titan has lakes and oceans of methane and ethane, so liquid hydrocarbons. We're potentially sending something called Dragonfly If all goes well, it would launch in 2026 and arrive in 2034. It'll have a dual quadricopter rotorcraft, so it can go around the surface of Titan, exploring prebiotic chemistry and making measurements that could lead to a better understanding of if it's potentially habitable. And then my last set of slides is to talk about exoplanets. It's really great now when we look up at the sky at night, we don't see just stars. We know that we see the stars that are likely to host billions and billions of exoplanets. So far, we have over 4,000 exoplanets that have been confirmed, and we're guessing that about 10% of them are Earth-like. However you want to define that, that's primarily a relationship to their sun in what might be called or has been called the habitable zone, and of a size that's similar to Earth or just a little bit bigger, so that it would actually have a chance of having liquid water on the surface. So again, an international effort for both space-based and ground telescopes around the world, and many things planned that like habitable HabEx or LUVOIR, which are ideas that NASA has for ways to look for and characterize exoplanets, and particularly look for signs of life in the future. So I just wanted to touch on this to remind you that we have all of these missions that we have planned, and the world is looking to the astrobiologists to come up with good definitions of what life is that could be detected, how you would go about that, what sorts of features we should be targeting that would end up with an unambiguous report that we had found life if we make those measurements and we see what we expect. So that's my challenge to all of you. There are also challenges in understanding the origin of life, and you'll hear more about that later. But I wanted to shift and introduce one of my colleagues, Melissa Kirven-Brooks, to talk about not only is this, well, this is a global effort. We need a world view in terms of understanding this, and we need to include as many people and overlook no one in this pursuit. So I've asked Melissa to share with you ideas she has about diversity and inclusion. And yeah, so take it away.
There, could you see a slide now?
I can see your slides.
Okay,
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All is good? Okay, and are they on? Okay,
Do you want to put it in? There we go.
Okay, sorry, so to start off, my NASA computer would not load Zoom. So I'm on my home computer, so I hope everything will work out. But I'd like to thank you for having me here today. So I'm in very smoky, oh, you don't, okay, I'll see if I can get my video up. Sorry about that. Start my video. I'm sorry about this. So I'm in smoky Northern California. So it's been quite a day so far. We're having an unusually smoky day today. So it's kind of orange outside. Feels a bit Marsy. But I wanted, so when Mary told me about the title, The Challenges, I thought about the challenges to the astrobiology future workforce. And that's what I spend a fair bit of my time doing. Tuesday and Wednesday of this week, and it's still Wednesday here, were a scholar strike in the US and Canada. So this was inspired by the athletes, the tennis and basketball players who decided to strike to honor Black Lives Matter a few weeks ago. So they asked, so the whole plan of the scholar strike is that professors and teachers were encouraged to not teach for the 2 days, Tuesday and Wednesday, and instead to focus on understanding and learning and rethinking things. So from the academic viewpoint, that would be, rethinking their curriculum and how to introduce how to change portions of their curriculum, perhaps. So personally, I took this as an opportunity to consider the challenges to the future astrobiology workforce and to examine everything that I work on. So the websites and the programs and the terminology, with the intent to sort of deracialize and decolonize what's there. So one of those things is to think about, who do these things appeal to? Who is currently included and who might feel excluded by some of these things. So what I will show you in the next few slides, and usually when I'm talking about the astrobiology program and the future workforce, I talk about all the programs and I just sort of zip through all these wonderful opportunities. But I decided maybe it's a good time, for my scholar strike, to look at these programs from the viewpoint of somebody who is thinking of coming into astrobiology. And, it might be a very different view than I have, and what things are appealing and what things might discourage them. So I'm going to start out with one very popular program, the Ask an Astrobiologist. Oh, it's even wiggling a little bit. So Ask an Astrobiologist is a roughly monthly webinar, and it's for the public. And typically, folks are, the invited guest is an early career, but not always an early career researcher. And they talk about their career paths and their research and its relevance to astrobiology. So that's a good way to draw people in. The next challenge that I thought of is that, most people don't know, how do I become an astrobiologist? And that's probably the most common question that I'm asked. So to become an astrobiologist, you need depth in one area, but you also need breadth across many areas. You have to prepare for somewhat of a multidisciplinary future. So you have to have comfort across many different fields. So I usually direct people to this webpage where we have a number of career path suggestions. So, consider this, but you can also come in here and you can, you should make sure you have a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And then at the end of the pipeline, you should be, consider yourself a competent astrobiologist. People have a hard time identifying themselves sometimes as astrobiologists, but astrobiologists come in many flavors. So of the many fields that are out there, I think that astrobiology is by its nature highly inclusive. We welcome everybody. The next place.
Excuse me, Melissa, do you mind just putting your slides onto presentation
Oh,
mode?
I'm sorry. I keep on plopping it over back and forth, but okay,
Thanks.
how's that?
That's great.
I'm sorry. Thanks for letting me know. So the next place that I'll go is to there are a number of online courses. They're generally free. So this is a good way for people to get a taste of astrobiology, to know the different focuses, the different foci, to get an idea of the vocabulary and the different places where astrobiology is being conducted. If people are still hanging in there, and for those who want to take the plunge, there are a list of degree programs. And so what I have listed here is from a website that has a variety of undergraduate and graduate programs. So these are both certificate programs and degree programs at public and private institutions across many geographic areas. So this is a good place for people to explore if they are, considering a graduate career in astrobiology. So what the next, one of the things that developed over the years was an interest in sort of giving everybody equal footing. So, so an astrobiology primer was developed by graduate students so that everybody, everybody sort of was on a level playing field. So the first edition was published in 2006. It goes across the whole breadth of astrobiology, introduces terminology and history, and sort of why it matters. So why do people care about mass-independent fractionation? What does it mean, and where does it fit within astrobiology? The first two editions of the primer were made available free access through the Astrobiology Journal, and the third one should be completed this fall. And the plan for that one is that it'll be web-based so that it can be updated frequently, because the graduate students are fabulous, but and some postdocs have been involved, but it takes years for them to update it because they're always starting from scratch. So this will be a great way to make it easily accessible for all and easily updated, because the field is always changing. So the next thing that, through one's graduate career in astrobiology, there are a bunch of opportunities. And one of the things that we wanted within the astrobiology program to encourage was opportunities for people to interact outside of their normal zone. So there are a variety, but I have 3 available to share of opportunities for graduate students and postdocs to gain the opportunities to network with others outside of their fields and outside of their universities. So the first one is the International Astrobiology Summer School, and it's a partnership with the Centro de Astrobiología in Spain and the astrobiology program. It's been held every year since 2002, except for this year because of the pandemic. But it's a week-long program for about 40 students. 20 are typically from the US and the remainder from Europe and other countries. There are lectures, there are field trips, there's a common project that people work with, and a number of field trips. So this is a great opportunity for folks to interact, meet others, and each year has a different topic, and to delve in depth into one topic. The next opportunity is AbGradCon, the Astrobiology Graduate Conference. And this one typically attracts about 100 attendees per year. It's held in different locations each year. This was from the 2019 conference, which was held in Utah. It's been held internationally twice in the past. And from seeing the pins earlier, this should be of interest to many, because the conference, which was supposed to start next week, was supposed to be held in Tokyo, and it will be held in Tokyo next year, most likely the 2nd week of September. ELSI is hosting it next year. And I actually want to point out one thing. So AbGradCon is organized by and for graduate students. So they're involved in everything from identifying the site where it'll be located to figuring out the schedule and the activities, the trips. They do the whole thing. They run the whole conference, and they've received support from the astrobiology program and others. But one thing that one group that was organizing it about 10 years ago suggested was that we offer the opportunity for proposal writing training. So they proposed something that has become known as the proposal writing retreat, which is a 3-day add-on to the conference, which happens prior. It's about 25 to 30 students, and they're split up into multidisciplinary groups. So they'll have a geologist and a chemist and an astronomer, for example, and they develop a project, write a proposal, and then the proposals are exchanged between the groups, and they evaluate them, and then they select the top 3. So this year I just happened to be reading a paper, and I shared it with the organizer, and it was about peer review and how to do a good peer review. So we thought, can we just add in a portion to teach the participants how to create a good, professional, unbiased peer review, so that people are being trained to judge the science and the technology, not necessarily the person or the institution. So the idea is to teach people early on how to evaluate things the correct way. So to avoid the bullying and the competition that often occurs, because this is one thing that we've seen can be a barrier for people to continue in science. You get a number of ugly, unsubstantiated peer reviews, and you can get very discouraged. So, so they're planning to incorporate that into the upcoming 2021 proposal writing retreat. So the next one is one which I hope will be near and dear to your hearts. It's the Australian Centre for Astrobiology Grand Tour. So for in 2013, 2015, and 2018, we, the astrobiology programs through the Astrobiology Institute had the extraordinary opportunity to support 14 early career astrobiologists to take part in this, this fabulous tour. There's always been tremendous interest, and we've had way too many applicants, but that's a good thing. But folks had the opportunity to experience firsthand these sites of astrobiology interest. They always returned and spoke about the opportunity to pick up or to touch or to see up close stromatolites. That just seemed to be the top thing for everybody. And to hear different interpretations of these things. And we intentionally would select a broad group of students to participate, so that often what we heard, some of the feedback that we got in the end was that in the evenings the astronomers would be pointing out things, in the daytime the geologists would be seeing things, the chemists would see something different, the biologists would see something different. So they would have the opportunity to all look at the same objects in different ways and share that, which was a tremendous opportunity. It also was a great opportunity for these junior scientists to spend time up close with these senior scientists who they revered greatly. So the last thing I'm going to bring up is the NASA postdoctoral program. So let's say we had that student who was just first interested, made their way all the way through graduate school, and now they're postdocs. So the NASA postdoctoral program is open to both US and international students, and provides 1 to 3 years of support. So in terms of challenges with this one, I was thinking about some of the challenges that have come about because of the pandemic. And this isn't just true for postdocs, but particularly for postdocs. Many of them are sort of feeling themselves in limbo. They're concerned that they don't know what their futures will be. And many people have said that we're at risk of losing a whole generation of scientists right now. There are mental health impacts because of the stress and the uncertainty. There are travel restrictions right now, so that people may not be able to, for example, come to the US or go other places because of the pandemic. And many may not want to journey too far from home because of this situation. There have been offers that have been withdrawn, and many recruitment opportunities have been frozen because of the financial impacts. So both universities and the funding agencies are dealing with some of these funding issues right now. So the way that the astrobiology program has approached this is to offer extensions for the NPP fellows who've been impacted. But so I sort of want to end where I started. So I've got a wonderfully corny picture, but I wanted, I'm entering this time of listening. So we have a lot of questions, and our first step is to distribute a survey. So we've been working on a survey, and actually it'll be a set of surveys to identify the makeup of the astrobiology community, because we don't have that information. So we want to find out who is there, perhaps who left, who isn't in the community, and why aren't they in the community? What are the barriers? So we're working with other agencies and with other societies to figure out if there are other needs that we're not meeting. So I'm asking now for your input. If you have any questions that you want to ask, if you have any advice that you want to provide. So what are the issues that you're facing? I put my email address up there. With whom are you partnering? And is there a way that we can help? Is there something that we can partner with you to help the situation? So I thank you again, and please do reach out to me. I'm hoping that we'll have some time for live questions perhaps, but now I think I'll turn it over to Daniella.
Thanks, Melissa. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay.
Yeah,
Let me see if I can share my slides. Here we go. Yes.
Yes.
Does everybody see
Yes.
my mouse? Okay, good. So I wanted to pick up where I think maybe Mary and Melissa left off, at least keep pulling on some themes that they're bringing up in terms of challenges for the future. My name is Daniella Scalice, and I'm the Education and Communications Lead for NASA's Astrobiology program. I join you tonight from the shores of the Chesapeake Bay, here in the occupied territories known today as Annapolis, Maryland, United States, North America. These are the lands of the Piscataway people who are still here. I want to start by describing the vision that I think both of them have touched on and put out for us. For a future where we envision a diverse community of scientists who are all working together to explore the universe, learn about our origins, see if we're alone or we're actually part of this big cosmic family of life. And of course, all of those things are the endeavor of astrobiology, where scholars of every color and culture and gender and walk of life, way of loving and praying, we're all working together side by side, and everyone is sharing all of themselves and bringing their unique perspectives and ways of knowing to their work. And in order to realize this vision, I want to suggest that each one of us individually and collectively needs to go on a journey. So what does that journey look like? It's an inward one, where we walk a path of self-exploration and personal evolution toward an understanding of why today doesn't look like it looks in the vision, and thinking about how we can shed all of the things within us individually, collectively, and all the things around us that are going to get in the way of that vision coming to life. This is a path we need to walk every day for the rest of our lives. Doing anything less than that risks the integrity of the vision. When white, Eurocentric, and Western values continue to dominate, we risk the perpetuation of inequality, because the equality that we will have will be performative. And I want to make a side note. I've been told that many times that some of the words and the terms that I use may make people feel uncomfortable. And so I invite you to feel uncomfortable and embrace it, and think about which words in particular, and maybe write them down, and maybe actually look inside and see what feelings you're having, and just embrace the whole thing. It's part of the journey. Maybe even write them down in the chat room. So this journey, we have to question, what have our colleagues of color sacrificed to be in this space here? How can we co-create a space in which no one ideology dominates and everyone is safe to bring their whole self to the endeavor? So let's look at our motivations to go on such a journey, to realize such a vision. As I know you are probably hearing as much as I am, this whole idea of engaging in equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts is so that the science can get better. We know, we've all seen the studies that diverse teams produce more innovative results. So we should diversify so that the science gets better. And I want to offer you an alternative perspective that I found in this quote that I'm going to read out to you. Keyshawn Ivory is an early career young Black astronomer. And he says that yes, diverse perspectives yield the best science is a true statement, but it's one that commodifies the lived experience of marginalized people by reducing them to their contributions to productivity. It's a capitalistic framework that shirks the basic truth that cultivating a field where the norm is respecting the humanity and validity of all people is the right thing to do for no reason other than that it is right. So I offer you that motivation just because it's right. Do it because it's right. If the science benefits, great, wonderful, lovely, but that shouldn't be our motivation. So now that we've thought about a vision, we've talked about the journey to kind of get there and checked our motivations, I want to offer you the potential first step to take, and that has to do with power. In every space we occupy, we have to look at the power dynamics. We can do it right now. Do it right now. We have to name ourselves and everybody else in that dynamic. And we have to work diligently and tirelessly to ensure that power is shared and those with less power have a safe space to express themselves and speak authentically. We need to work to understand, quote, social practice as layered with concurrent power imbalances, which foreclose on some and make room for others to negotiate and pursue their desired ends. I put forth to you that when you have power, you don't actually have more rights, you have more responsibilities. And so with all of that said, I want to share with you a story of what can happen when we hold that vision, get on that journey with the right motivations, and do the work to share power. The story focuses on a collaboration I've been part of between a federal agency and a native nation here in the US. The key to the story is co-creation. So, and I also want to say before I go on, the story is about an educational partnership, but the co-creation principles also apply to scientific research. So, a few words about co-creation. Co-creation represents a different sort of power dynamic. It still is a power dynamic, but it's different than the norm. Co-creation is possible when you have a shared vision. A shared vision is possible with relationship and trust that gets built over time. Relationship and trust are possible when humility and respect are centered. And centering humility and respect is, of course, always possible. And so we have to look at what gets in the way of centering those things. So as part of this journey, we need to ask, why do we not often or always center humility and respect? What values of the white Eurocentric Western culture are preempting us from working in this place? Hubris, which leads to entitlement and extraction. There are numerous studies of research going on in indigenous lands that are incredibly extractive in terms of samples, data, the whole partnership. All of that can lead to cognitive imperialism and cultural hegemony, which of course perpetuates racialization and colonization. And unfortunately, these values are often resident in how science and education takes place today, certainly here in mainstream US. And so becoming aware of these things is the first step. And if you're uncomfortable, I applaud you and encourage you to continue to embrace that. So let's then look at this story of this partnership. We have been calling it the NASA and the Navajo Nation Partnership. This is Window Rock in Window Rock, Arizona, which is the seat of the Navajo Nation, the tribal government seat. And we've worked a lot in there over the years. This is our team, myself on the left and my Navajo colleagues on the right. It all started in 2005. So we are in year 16 of our partnership and we're still going strong. We convened what we call a focus group with Navajo educators, people from the tribal government, other community leaders, spiritual leaders, with a question on the table. Is the Navajo Nation interested in partnering with NASA on educational initiatives? And the reason why I wanted to highlight this is because baked into this process, to this approach, is the recognition, acknowledgement, and respect of sovereignty and self-determination. So often we see educational programs, STEM education programs anyway, that just assume that everybody wants what they have. And so we started with asking if people want to work with us at all, recognizing that it's not required and they have their own way of understanding the universe. So it was a powerful 2-day meeting. We discussed how education works on the nation. There was some interesting new tribal legislation being introduced at the time, the Sovereignty and Education Act, which since passed. They were in need of developing materials and teaching standards to teach Navajo culture and language in their classrooms. So a lot was going on at this time. The discussion was wide-ranging, but I've kind of digested some of the points. From the Navajo side of the house, they were talking about how their education system has changed over time, been more colonized, and they want to rebuild a new system in its place, which, quote, preserves and perpetuates the identity and authenticity of what it means to be Navajo, and they're prioritizing the teaching of culture and language in the classroom. From the NASA side, from my side, listening and being part of this discussion, it was very clear to me NASA wasn't being invited in to fix anything or take responsibility for anything or come in with with science and telling everybody how the world works and that, their Navajo ways of knowing are invalid. But rather we were being invited in as partners in service to Diné youth. Diné is the word that they use for themselves, the people. Just in service to the youth and communities. We represent the science authentically, obviously, and contribute to a shared vision that we all got on board with. So the outcomes were that yes, a collaboration is very desired. The partnership needs to be equitable instead of one way, top down from the NASA side. The two ways of knowing, both scientific and cultural, need to be treated as 100% equitable. No one will dominate over the other, and anything we produce together needs to bring together these two ways of knowing and these two bodies of knowledge, again, in equity and equality. This is where we started building relationship and trust. We still do that. That still happens all the time. And we continue to revisit these principles even today. We went on over the years to co-create 2 educator guides that do just that. They bring together both cultural knowledge of the stars and the moon and other space science topics broadly, together with scientific knowledge. And we've come to call our model culturally based dual learning. And I'll show you some pictures and talk through some of the programs that we've developed and what this looks like. This is our teacher workshop model that we would bring teachers together for a 2-day event. We would have scientists as well as medicine people and spiritual cultural experts come in and convey the content, and we would train them, so to speak, on the activities in the booklet. These are some pictures from a summer camp for youth that we developed over the years. And it's the same kind of model. We go out, but we go out to field sites that are on the nation or near it, on sacred lands. And we would go to these fantastic cultural sites that are at once sacred as well as geologically interesting and informative. And again, we would have scientists and medicine people on the trail talking story from both sides of the house. So those are the 2 main ways in which we worked with the materials we developed, but let's take a little bit of a deeper dive. What does culturally based dual learning actually look like? What does it mean? So in order to talk about that, I want to convey to you that I have permission from my Navajo colleagues to do a Navajo cultural concept called Shabak Ego. And it's this idea, the word translates into English as the path of the sun. So basically carving an east to west apparent motion throughout the sky. And as seen from the top, looking down into their cultural structure called a hogan, if you were looking at a round structure and looking down through a hole in the middle, you would see a circle that starts in the east and moves in a circular fashion to the west. And that's Shabak Ego movement. And so the idea is that everything begins in the east. Everything begins with the rising of the sun, with this apparent motion. And east, south, and it moves to the south, through the west, to the north, back to the east. And this motion governs all aspects of life. On the left, you can see that the tribal village has this Diné philosophy of education, where in the east, everything is beginning, and you have ideas and imagination. Moving into the south, you're motivated, you're preparing, you're making, you're doing. In the west, you're bringing things to life, you're collaborating, you're learning. And in the north, you're reflecting and gaining wisdom and sort of bringing it all together. And the cycle begins again. So again, here it is kind of laid out in the east, you're developing ideas. And again, this is applied just to thinking and learning. Shabak Ego movement is applied to all kinds of things in Diné culture. In the south, manifesting in the West, analyzing and reflecting, and in the North, creating knowledge and wisdom. So there's a little bit of overlap, but I think you get the idea, basic idea of the motion. So with this knowledge shared into the partnership, we co-created an activity, a hands-on activity for kids that lays this foundation using this concept of Shapik ego movement, and how that has guided the creation of all that is, the creation of the physical and spiritual universe in the Navajo Diné cosmology. And we've paired that with stellar evolution as a concept from scientific knowledge. And so we have these cards. And what happens is that the telling, we've abandoned the word story, the telling of that Diné cosmology is given by an elder and a medicine person. And the cards are laid down in piles as each thing is created. And so we lay down the directions first. Everything happens according to these directions, and everything begins in the East. And so the spiritual beings laid down all kinds of things, like in this case, the gemstones. There's abalone and white shell, turquoise, abalone, and obsidian. Those were all brought into being in this fashion. There are 4 sacred mountains made of earth that are brought into being. They provide literally the physical boundaries to the Navajo homeland in the Southwest US. These are actual mountains. Wind was laid down and in these various directions, and with that bringing various forms of moisture, therefore bringing seasons. So the story goes on, and all kinds of things were brought into being in this way, in this fashion: east, south, west, north, east, south, west, north. Again, with the beginning in the east, the bringing into fruition in the south, the sort of harvesting of knowledge, if you will, pulling it all together in the autumn, and then solidifying wisdom and knowledge, and of course, bringing in new questions in the north. And so we tell this whole cosmology, and it's quite complete. And then we bring in cards that reflect the stellar evolutions, life cycle of a star. And we bring in a nebulae, giant molecular cloud imagery in the east. In the south, we bring in images of planetary system formation with the young star forming in the middle. In the west, we show images of a mature star. And in the north, we show images of a supernova. And I know everyone's looking at this going, well, the sun isn't going to go supernova, but these are just images to illustrate a concept. And we do talk in that level of detail. But we also layer in the scientific method, so to speak. Remember that thing we all learned in 2nd grade or 5th grade? Starting in the east with inquiry and hypothesis, questioning what's going on here? Let's do some experiments and observations down here in the south to see what's going on. Let's collect our data, analyze our data, harvest our information in the West, and draw our conclusions and our next questions in the North. And so in this way, we are able to map or parallel or resonate the cultural knowledge with scientific knowledge, as well as the methodologies. So that's how we do culturally based dual learning of both, in this case, Navajo cosmology and scientific understanding of the origins.
Excuse me, Daniela, sorry, I'm just going
Yes.
to let everybody know that there's 5 minutes collectively left in your session.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to
Thanks.
just not really look at these slides and end saying that we're working with the Astrobiology's origin story to simultaneously cultivate cultural and scientific identity for Native youth. They have one foot in each world, and they don't have to sacrifice one identity for the other. They can be both Navajo and scientist. And so with that, I'll just say, use your power wisely, because you have it. Okay, thank you.
Well, that was really something to have that triad of collective knowledge shared with our group. Thank you all so very much. Very powerful statements, I think, from each 3 of our speakers. There are a lot of comments in the chat room, and it's interesting to see what's come up there. I think it's a little bit difficult to start asking questions, particularly, there were some very technical ones for Mary, and maybe you can go onto the chat room. How, you know, how does life relate to the size of a planet? How is water detected? Those kinds of technical questions. But I love the more moral issues that have come up. Daniela is very powerful. Melissa is also very insightful in terms of, I think both messages really point out one of the great strengths of astrobiology. And I think that the NASA Astrobiology Institute has really taken the lead on is the inclusion and that very deep awareness of the value of having contributions from so many different stakeholders. One of the comments that's come up here, and it's clear that you know, you have had some tremendous opportunities because of the funding available through a very large organization like NASA, which is not so easy for some other countries to pursue the kind of objectives in terms of the time and effort. Like one thing that impressed me with Daniella's talk is the amount of time and care that's taken to building those relationships. And I know that NASA Astrobiology Institute in general has been incredibly supportive for early career researchers, from people from all sorts of backgrounds. And that's a wonderful opportunity I think you've had. So there are some comments about how people from outside the US can get involved with what everybody sees as a really exciting program. So there were some questions about that from Europe and from Latin America. Is that something that one of you would care to address a little bit?
Can I'd just like to say one quick thing, and that is that I'm so glad that Daniella and Melissa spoke, and I wanted to bring them on. But Daniella's work with, particularly with the Navajo Nation, has been a labor of love that has gotten very little funding. And I just want to, it's a shout out to Daniella's commitment and a lot of what Melissa does as well. And it's part of the reason I wanted them to talk to all of you, to know that, yes, they have the support of the astrobiology program and sometimes of NASA. But this is a commitment by two incredible people that I think represent a generalized commitment by the astrobiology community. And so, you know, I encourage you guys, because I know we don't have a lot of time, to contact both Melissa and Daniella about opportunities to get involved, more about Daniella's and Melissa's experience with engaging underrepresented groups and underserved groups, because there's a lot that can be done without having a lot of funding. And it's, you know, we're hoping that one of the things that the movement that's been going on in the US will do is get more funding for these things, but they've done remarkable things even without.
Okay, that's tremendous. So I certainly will take that opportunity and look forward to having some conversations. It's really sparked some ideas in my mind about engaging with the Indigenous community at the site where we have our ancient fossils. We've started a bit of that process, and my students have done some outreach and engagement there. But I think the idea of really developing a full partnership is really inspirational. So. So thank you all three for taking the time out of your day at various parts across the US for contributing to this. That's really made a very special contribution. So my thanks, and for everyone, I know personally that they are very open to communication and dialogue. So do take that advantage and that invitation to contact them personally and start a dialogue.
Thank you guys for doing this. Can I just say thank you guys for doing this, but we hope we get to see you in person soon.
Yeah, of course. Well, I think we're all looking forward.
Technology is wonderful, but we miss all of you. So
yes, absolutely. That personal aspect is so important. And, you know, we were lucky to be able to come to the AbSciCon in Seattle last year, and it's such a wonderful opportunity to engage deeply in a personal way with participants. It's always so satisfying. And that was our intent, of course, with our idea for the LC conference. We just have to put that on hold and allow what kind of connection we can to come through this medium, which works reasonably well, but it's no substitute for the real thing. And of course, we all look forward to that in the future. Thank you so much. So now I'd like to move on into the start of our Hot Springs, This is Studying for the Origin of Life section with a talk by Bruce Damer from Santa Cruz. Bruce is a polymath. He's got fingers in many different pies across a wide spectrum of deep thinking. And he brings his insightful knowledge, I guess, from a variety of fields and disciplines towards a project that he's been deeply involved with for the past decade or more, I suppose, with a close colleague of his, David Deemer, and with our group and people in New Zealand. And so we're very excited to have give his talk about the origin of life in hot springs, a model that he and others have developed, and hopefully with some time for discussion afterwards. So Bruce, do you want to unmute and open up your screen?
Okay, will do. Okay.
That's great.
Great.
Yep, so we can hear you and we can see your slides. So the floor is yours.
Wonderful. I want to put a shout out to my colleague, David Deemer, whose house survived the fire in Bonnie Doon, but they're only on generator for a couple of hours a day. And so he's down at a UC Santa Cruz facility right now, and he can pipe in. I'm just going to run the slides, and Dave may say a word or two, and he's available for the Q&A. And just that the Dave family are all right, but there was 1,000 homes burnt up there in the last 2 weeks. So with that introduction, I want to thank you, thank the AAM and the organizers for allowing us to come for this third year to the meeting, and our wonderful collaboration now over the past 4 or 5 years, putting together our chemical model, the hot spring hypothesis for an origin of life, together with the geology and now field testing. So without further ado, I'll get started. So this is the two of us, Dave and I, at Bumpus Hell about 4 years ago, which is a geothermal field up in Northern California. It's a lot of fumarolic activity up there, very different than some of the environments we're working in these days. But this is where we started our field work. So the question is, can life begin in such a place? And as Martin knows, having gone to the 50th anniversary last year of the fall of the Murchison meteorite in Australia in 1969, raining down organic compounds at least 4.6 billion years old. And this points out for us, life actually has to begin with chemistry. Maybe it certainly begins with physics. Everything is based on physics, but really this is the start of our story of how life might begin. One of the pieces of Murchison is shown here, and it has this fusion crust. And that crust is like an ablative heat shield, kind of like the old Apollo capsules. So it actually allows the heat to be ablated away and radiate away so that the interior remains the same. And this is how we get these intact materials down onto the surface of the Earth. Next, 1971, Ames received a sample here at NASA and took it apart and analyzed it and found that about 1.5% was insoluble kerogen, and then there was very thin slices you can see here were soluble organics in this carbonaceous meteorite. And you can see how it's broken down. Dave calls it a parts list here, and it really is a parts list for prebiotic chemistry. You see the carboxylic acids, which you'll see in a moment. Amides is the base of amino acids. We see even purines in here. So it's a tremendously rich complex made in cosmochemistry, made in space, in between the stars and the formation of solar systems. So let's take a look. So this is our part of our sources. Other sources can come from the atmosphere and from hot springs themselves. So here is the dance of the amphiphiles, basically lipids, fatty acids that are placed into solution. This is actually derived from living material, and it shows what happens when you add a droplet of water to the slide, and the water finds its way under that cover slip, and it bulks up these membranes spontaneously form, and they actually generate and bud off compartments that we call vesicles for our purposes. And think of it as how soap forms soap bubbles. So next, what happens when you take some of these old carbonaceous chondrite meteorites and extract them into an acidic solution? Well, you get the formation of membranes. And this is work that Dave did in the early 80s, which was really kind of world news for the origin of life. It showed that compartments can come from space, the compartments that we need for life to begin, and that those compartments can encapsulate a dye. They can form in solution, and they can surround materials. We call this self-assembly, which is an important word that we use. So here is membranes are the essential for the origin of life because they can concentrate, they can capture materials and concentrate them, such as polymers like DNA, enzymes, et cetera, et cetera. Functional polymers can be crowded together. And when we dehydrate those solutions down and then rehydrate them, we have found that we can form the polymers of life. So there's DNA and decanoic acid vesicles you see. Here's a video made in Australia, made in Melbourne by Ryan Norcus, that shows what we think a geyser might have looked like erupting on a volcanic landscape 4 billion years ago on a volcanic landmass, splashing your adjacent rocks and raising and lowering the level of a pool, of a hydrothermal field on this ancient Hadean landscape. So this very similar to what happens today in these environments. And that we think that this is an engine because it can concentrate materials. When it evaporates them, it can form these layers that become wetted again and then encapsulate the organics. So here's how it works. So we can see in A and B, that's one cycle of drying and wetting, 2 cycles in C, 3 and 4 cycles, and you can see that those compartments are glowing because they're starting to encapsulate the polymers. In this case, it's DNA in these vesicles that are being encapsulated. So this is sort of laboratory microscopic proof of this step. And I'm going to jump past this. This is Rotorua. We're going to do a little bit more of a view of that later. This is where we did our field work, the last 2 years of field work. So sum up Dave's part of the slides. The solar system generates these icy dust particles that have a lot of organics. When the Earth is formed and stabilized, and the oceans are there and the volcanic islands are there, you can get a delivery of these organics into these concentrating environments of the pools. If the pools cycle, then you can potentially get the beginnings of prebiotic chemistry. And lastly, we visited both Shark Bay and the Pilbara 5 years ago with Martin's team, and Malcolm Walter was there. And these stromatolites are some of the oldest evidence of the earliest life on Earth. And it really inspired us. It inspired us to work even harder on our model and look at the hot spring environment and the cycling because of the discovery of the geyserite. Tremendously inspiring for our group. So I'm going to now take you on a next part of the journey. We call it the big picture because we go back 100 years, more like 150 years, almost 125 years. Charles Darwin wrote in a letter to a friend that if we could conceive in some warm little pond somewhere, when he was asked about where life can begin, with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity, etc., that a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex changes. And everyone knows the warm little pond part of the sentence. But few people sort of were paying attention to the protein compound chemically forming, ready to undergo more complex changes. That's the part that where we're starting in the 21st century. A protein compound is a polymer. So he's pointing to the fact we need to form large molecules, and we need to allow them to become more complex, to grow in size and become more complex. So what Darwin identified was away from equilibrium chemistry back in the 19th century. And we're going to show you how we can get that to work. So here's our landscape for Darwin's warm little pond of the 21st century. We're seeking the Goldilocks conditions. You know, Mary and others will talk about the Goldilocks zones and habitable zones. Well, some of our colleagues have identified that there's a Goldilocks chemistry locally. So Sutherland and Powner have identified that it's, you know, some kind of little terrestrial pool somewhere exposed to ultraviolet, because their work shows that you can produce a lot of these compounds using UV chemistry. But what we're saying here is that this Goldilocks pool would have just enough time and conditions to generate a robust form of, say, pre-life or proto-life that could then adapt across a landscape to the more extreme environments of, say, the shallow marine, where you have salts which tend to disrupt membranes. So if we look at a landscape, it's richly endowed with the mediums that we need. We need to collect material from the atmosphere, concentrate it, cycle it, then allow the early form of life that forms to adapt to stresses and then distribute. And so thousands or tens of thousands of pools, lakes, etc., are a perfect sort of fitness landscape, allowing mixing to establish robust life over a period of maybe tens to hundreds of millions of years. And the converging lines of evidence are interesting here. We call this sort of a continuity in the rock record. Here's the geyserite I mentioned before, discovered by Tara Jokic here and Martin, which shows, you know, a hot spring formation, the oldest hot spring discovered yet in the solar system, with clear signs of life. This is a stromatolite we picked up in the southern locality, and see those little balled up pieces there. Here's a lakeshore stromatolite, lacustrine stromatolite. Here's modern stromatolites. So there's a continuity in the rock record of life as far back as we can see on land, and thriving communities in land-based freshwater settings, as of course there is in the marine shore as well. So here's Murchison that we talked about earlier. Here's some of the components in it. And more recently, the European mission to the comet, the recent publication, 40% of the organic compounds in the dust from this comet. So the dust of the comet itself is rich in organics. So all of this material can fall and concentrate in pools, but if it falls in the bulk of the ocean, it's too dilute and can't participate in chemistry. Jumping forward to taking the chemistry from the field, from the laboratory to the field, here's our first experiment done in Rotorua in 2018. And what I'm doing here is hydrating and letting dry these vials that are set in a heat block in a pool at Hell's Gate at about 93 C. And when I pull the vials out and see that they're dry, you can see the membranous structures that are formed in the bottom of the vials. That's where the cooking is happening to form our polymers. So we're forming RNA-like polymers between these layers. So these smudges here on the right, there's a laboratory version, and then there's the hot spring product. The smudge indicates you've got something about 100 units in length. Let's take a look at how this works, if you can all hear me.
It's just a case of weird science. Leading American scientist Dr. Bruce Damer is at Rotorua's Hell's Gate, conducting research trials aiming to answer the age-old question, how did we get here?
It's very exciting. It's 21st century science, revolutionary science to watch. If we can find this cycle, it's the engine of creation, effectively. Also that we came not from an individual, not from competing individuals, but from a network, a collaborative community was at the tap root of the tree of life.
Dr. Damer's research could turn previous origins of life science on its head. He's testing whether hot springs on land may have been the starting point for life itself. Dr. Damer's searching for RNA, a nucleic acid, and the basis of all living cells.
So what we think is that RNA could have been the first polymer that life synthesized first at random in a process like this, and then picked through selection, through these cycling protocells, which we're doing here in the hot spring, picked ones that worked.
For years, scientists had accepted the theory that life began in hydrothermal vents in the ocean. Charles Darwin once speculated that biological molecules might form in a warm little pond, and Dr. Damer believes this to be much closer to the truth.
If we can show to our colleagues and to the world that we can self-assemble an important biopolymer of life called RNA in a hot spring pool that's cycling, in the conditions that would have been around in the early Earth on these big volcanic islands, our colleagues are really going to seriously look at doing more experiments. And it'll create a whole movement, a whole sort of paradigm shift in origin of life thinking, back to Darwin's warm little pond, only now it's a cycling hot little pool.
Jaden McLeod, Local Focus.
So hopefully you all caught that. So now what we do is if we find that if we can cycle in these pools, all this mixture, all this soup, if you will, it's kind of like a roulette wheel. So these protocells you see on the left here are like balls on the roulette wheel. And some of them land into nice locations where that makes them more robust because they just happen to have the right polymers inside. And so they actually deliver their cargoes through multiple cycles of wetting and drying, and you end up with a buildup of polymers, some of which might have functions. So we get, this is our roulette wheel, the way that we've designed it. So up in the upper left, we have dehydration of all of those membranes down. They form these layers. And then within the layers, polymers can form. They can stitch together. Then when you have your water come back into your pool, the layers butt off, just like you saw in Dave's video. They butt off new compartments, new protocells. If the protocells contain polymers, they might be stabilized by those polymers. So if you see the little purple one on the screen there, that may be a stable vesicle or stable protocell that's going to deliver its polymers back down to this moist phase, this gel phase, which is now collecting the polymers and putting them back into the synthesis cycle. Very much actually like a prototypical living system itself. So what this is the kinetic trap that cycles these vast populations and gives rise, we predict, to the progenote, Carl Woese's idea of the transitional unit carrying life from simple protocells to complex living microbial communities. So let's put it all together. We're going to hopefully have plenty of time for questions. And Luke Steller, after me, is going to do a lot more of the experimental reporting, especially from the 2020 field season and his laboratory work. So the big picture is we had synthesis of a lot of the organics in space, delivery onto the landscape where they accumulate in these small pools. The accumulating material forms vesicles. Those vesicles get delivered into a cycling pool. You can see our engine here, wet, dry, and moist cycling, which can do the polymeric evolution that we need to get something that is lifelike, that becomes more like a living system. Then early life could emerge, for instance, at the outflow points of these hot spring pools. The early life has to capture energy from sunlight if it's far from the energy sources in the hydrothermal system. So then you get the adaptation to dilute settings like rivers and lakes, and eventually the riverine settings go into estuaries and you get salt. So you have to have active pores. And then when you get these active pores, more robust microbial communities emerge and they form those rock towers that we saw at Shark Bay. So there's the whole continuity in the rock record. And here's our hot spring setting, our lacustrine stromatolite, and a marine stromatolite. So this is the whole picture that we put together over the last 5 years or so. Another view of implications of, we did this for our article for Astrobiology published in March. We compared an origin of life in the submarine setting in hydrothermal vents, you can see at the bottom, and the thermodynamic barriers it has to overcome should it be able to arise to become marine cyanobacteria, adapted for capturing energy from sunlight, to eukaryotes and marine algae. And we think that we've shown that origin of life on land is a much easier in terms of its combinatoric and thermodynamic hurdles it has to overcome. There's a great continuity between these pools and their concentrating abilities, the capture of sunlight on a continuous basis, all the way to land plants, freshwater algae and land plants. And recently, land plants have been shown through genetic studies to have been originated in freshwater pools on land as well. So a land-based journey is more thermodynamically plausible. Coming to implication number 2, how does this help guide you where to look for a life on a place like Mars? Well, Mars 2020 Percy, as they're calling the new rover that just launched to Jezero Crater, we think that if they can find evidence for hot springs on Mars, like here at Columbia Hills, discovered by Spirit, these look like silicate nodules that we find in El Tatio and in Chile. If we can look for hot spring settings, we might have a good shot at biopreservation there for this search for life. Last implication, and Mary talked about exoplanets, exosolar systems. Here's a general principle. We can't define what life is, but perhaps we can define how life can start anywhere. So if you have, to start life, we propose that you need polymers with encapsulation and combinatorial selection, no matter what chemistry or planetary environment you're on. And we propose that aqueous carbon chemistry in cycling pools is a required, but not necessarily the case requirement. But that perhaps in this case, if you can't get cycling, wet dry cycling, like you wouldn't be able to get in a hydrothermal environment that would be deep in the oceans of Enceladus, for example, you can't start life there, but of course they still might be habitable. Recently, the public interest has grown in this approach. This is our Scientific American article of 2017 that that combined all of the discoveries of the geyserite and the hot spring origins. There's the Scientific American version. And there's the Astrobiology issue from March with more of Ryan Norcus's artwork on it, showing a Hadean hot spring. And this is my closing slide, if I've got enough time. I promised to give you some new directions in the science. And this is new thinking that has been emerged through the astrobiology article and a lot of interaction with colleagues, that this hot spring origin approach, we've sort of abstracted and identified that there are 3 processes that carry you from physics into biology. And on the right, they show you the roll of the dice, shaping probability, and that's crowding in vesicles, interaction networks, and that's when vesicles or protocells are crowded together and products can diffuse from one to the other. And then you need the rise of a memory system, which would be a protogenome, could start with templating. So that's our computer science abstraction of this origin model, this PIM cycle. And I'm preparing a book proposal for an academic publisher, and it'll have a lot more detail about this PIM formalism. But what it implies is that you can get, the following thing can happen. So we make 4 new predictions. So the first prediction, if we're doing science on protocells, is you attach your polymers to the membrane, so they're co-located on the membrane, you get much more concentration. You get much more ability to interact. So we're predicting that it's membrane attached co-located polymers rather than polymers floating freely inside protocells. And there's good work at the University of Washington now happening on this. The second prediction is that the aggregates of the protocells represent a primitive Woese progenode, and that there will be an entire science emerging maybe in the 20s and 30s called progenote science. And we put that into the topic area for this meeting for the first time. The progenote term is being used in a meeting. And it's this aggregate of protocells that are in communication chemically. So the aggregate of protocells together has much more powerful mechanisms to grow and adapt than an individual protocell. So that's the Carl Woese's conception. Third prediction is that a hierarchy of reaction networks can emerge spontaneously in progenotes as protocell populations respond to the stresses. And this is some really good work by Albert Fehrenbach and Zach Adam and colleagues actually at ELSI, Tony Gia, on these radiolytic networks that are emerging spontaneously that can show a hierarchy of of network effects that could lead to metabolic reactions. And this is a frontier for origin of life as we cross from protocell to progenote toward the living system in our thinking. And the last prediction based on PAM is that these metabolic circuits will give rise to a genetic memory system, starting with templating. And there's excellent work being done on this in synthetic biology and synthetic protocells to get templating to work, and some work done in our lab on non-enzymatic templating and copy. So with that, and I know it's a mouthful there, I just want to acknowledge all of our colleagues that we work closely together with, and thank Elsie and the ACA for supporting this conference, and hoping that I left enough time for questions. And I'll stop the screen sharing. There we have it.
Great. Thanks so much for that overview, Bruce. There's only about a couple of minutes left, actually. There's quite a lot of chat on the chat bar. One of the things that did come up, and maybe you can address this quickly, is could the first molecules, this is a question from Faoud El-Baidouri, could the first molecules be RNA DNA hybrids rather than RNA? And that stems from a question about the stability of both of those polymers. Do you want to get back on that, Bruce?
Definitely. And Dave, are you on the line?
Yes, I think I am. Are we?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Yes. I just want to point out that Ram Krishnamurti is one of the world's experts on RNA chemistry. And he is moving away from an RNA world toward just what the question was about. And that is that it's pretty obvious to Ram that DNA is as likely as RNA, and very, very much plausible, more plausible that there was a DNA RNA world together. They co-evolved. And that makes sense to me. And I think we all can think in that direction.
Fantastic. Well, there's some relatively new science hot off the presses. Yeah, there's quite a lot of chat in there. So listen, I think because we're only a minute away from the next talk, we'll probably wrap that up. But given the smoke-ravaged nature of your local environment, Bruce, we wanted to extend a great thanks for making that effort to attend. And yeah, for both you and Dave, we're very happy to know that you're safe for the moment, and hopefully that threat dissipates relatively soon.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Martin.
Yeah, great to see you guys both. So let's keep it moving on. Our next talk, which is due to start right about now, is by Luke Steller, who is a PhD candidate at the Australian Centre for Astrobiology at UNSW. And he's going to pretty much give a bit more detail about some of the stuff that Bruce was pointing to about doing some of this sort of origin of life experimental work in a field setting, and which leads in some ways nicely to the next session on messy chemistry, because hot springs are not pretty environments. Luke, are you up? You may be muted.
Perfect. Yep, so can everyone hear and see my slides? Is that all good to go?
That's all good, Luke. Thank you. A little bit louder, maybe.
Yeah, okay, cool. I'll have to shout. Here we go.
Okay.
So yeah, so thank you so much. I really I'm following on from what Bruce and Dave have done. They're really, the pioneers, the experts in this field. And I've been really lucky enough through Martin, my supervisor, to join them and to be able to take part in their research. So before I begin, I'd like to just acknowledge that I'm on Gadigal land here today, which is the Aboriginal land for Sydney. And a lot of these sites, both these hot springs and in the Pilbara, the ancient rocks are really sacred sites for the First Nations people in both these areas. I really want to pay my respects to that. So as people have mentioned, Martin mentioned yesterday, Melissa mentioned today, going out in the field with experts is a really great way to meet and to chat and to explore new ideas. So beginning of this year, before COVID shut everything down, Dave, Bruce, and myself and a whole bunch of Kathy Campbell students from the University of Auckland, we went out to the field to repeat some of these experiments. You can see that's Dave there, giving us some of his wisdom, to like Kitty, Emma, and myself. And you can see us here all lying down together, relaxing, having some great talks about the origin of life. I thought it was great. You can see Dave there is doing his characteristic hand behind his head, laid back look that was immortalized in a NASA comic book about the origin of life, which I thought was brilliant. As well as relaxing and hanging out and having some really stimulating chats, we also did some really interesting chemistry. So you can see here, this is a 2.0 repeat of that experiment you saw from Bruce. And one thing that we added that was quite interesting was you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, this rock plate pretty much, and that's a pillar basalt. So it's a slab of basalt that comes straight out of the Pilbara. So it would be around 3.5 billion years old. And I collected that in the field last year and I cut it open, drilled some little holes in it. And we're actually starting to do experiments with RNA polymerization right on a rock. So we're trying to get further away from the lab, further away from these inert glass test tubes that we do stuff in, and try and get as realistic as we can. So unfortunately, due to COVID, all the samples we got from that rock are in the deep freeze right now. We haven't had time to analyze that because of lab restrictions, but we're definitely trying to do more realistic experiments in the field. So my talk today is all around the bigger picture. I know Bruce said the big picture in his talk, and I don't want to upstage him at all, but I'm really looking at more generally what can hot springs do in a broad origin of life context and looking at the prebiotic chemistry. So what do you need to build up to where the progeny could form? Some, I don't know, issues when I talk to prebiotic chemists all comes around that everyone has different reactions they think are needed to make really important chemicals, and they all have different and sometimes competing conditions. As you even saw in the chat, some people are saying that you need alkaline conditions to stabilize RNA, but then you need acidic conditions to polymerize them, and there's all these different potentially competing conditions needed. And how do you find a solution for this? Beyond that, a lot of reactions that are done in the lab, they're rarely one-pot experiments. They require continued input or change conditions that at the moment require people to change those experiments. Or what happened when there's no one's around? How can you create that complexity? And I'm really studying the geochemical nature of hot springs to see if they can be the really environment to bring all these different reactions together. So this is a beautiful little aerial photograph from Iraqi Karako, which is an amazing name for an amazing hot spring site in New Zealand. And the thing I just love about this site here is that it has the most amazing, and all through hot spring fields all around the world, the most amazing complexity. So just simply looking down, you have all these different pools that are constantly mixing and flowing into each other. In some of them, water level may drop, so then the water flows back into another one. So they're constantly splashing and exchanging material. And that material can be incredibly diverse. So we have here a picture of, jumping forward a bit. We have here a picture of it looks just like a muddy pool next to a little lake at Waitapo. So this is in New Zealand as well. There's some people on the left there you can see for scale, so maybe 10, 15 meters across this site. And just to the untrained eye, it looks all pretty plain, but we went out there with Marta, my supervisor, Kathy Campbell and her team, and we mapped the chemistry of all these pools, and just simply looking at temperature and pH, simply looking at temperature and pH, you can see there's a lot of diversity here. So just for example, these two little red boxes down the right-hand side, you have a pool that is a pH of 5.5, so slightly acidic, but 92 degrees Celsius, so incredibly hot. And that's 20 centimeters away from a pool that's around 3 pH, so nearly 100 times more acidic, but only 45 degrees, so a lot more temperate. And these pools are constantly flowing into each other, creating some really interesting complex chemical systems. You have that lake down at the bottom, which is a pH of 2.5, and it's flowing down into bigger lakes and bigger pools. So you have the ability for almost an infinite number of different chemical fluids mixing together in different ways and different combinations, and constantly shifting as water patterns throughout the year, rainfall, etc. changes, as the groundwater changes, as the geology changes. You can have changes in these systems, which could promote the complexity needed for these complex reactions. Beyond that, we have a whole lot of diversity, not only in the fluid chemistry, but also in the mineral complexity. So I'm considering minerals as a geologist. I don't feel I'm too biased in prebiotic chemistry, mainly because it's almost impossible to avoid minerals in prebiotic experiments. when you think of the different environments where life may have formed, being in a deep sea hydrothermal vent, or being in a hot spring pool on a surface or on a lake or somewhere else like that, you're going to have rocks around to hold that water. You're going to have mineral grains floating around. So really, when you're considering the origin of life, at some point you have to consider, how do your reactions interact with minerals? Could be really positive. It could be negative as well. So that's something that, as prebiotic chemists, we should be considering this. There's a lot of potential positives from minerals. As a lot of you will know, there are important reactions that they can promote or catalyze. Ferris did some really amazing experiments using montmorillonite, so that's a clay, and he showed that activated RNA can sort of template or stick to these clay sheets, and that can promote the long polymerization of this RNA. Mineral surfaces can also be potentially a source of chirality. So as all of you know, biological materials can be chiral, so they have a handedness to them, and mineral surfaces can be chiral as well. So maybe there was some interaction between mineral surfaces and these organic compounds during an origin of life process that created chirality. Beyond that, these minerals can also have a selectively stockpile and protect organic materials. So that's shown in this great recent paper from David Baum's lab with Lena Vincent and Ryo, and they're showing that if you have different kinds of minerals present and different lengths of RNA, you actually have selective absorption of those different lengths of RNA onto the mineral surface. So this sheet's really just showing you here that the longer lengths of RNA absorb a lot more and are harder to be released from that mineral surface compared to the shorter ones. So over time, if you're polymerizing all these different lengths of RNA, shorter ones will be released quicker and maybe washed downstream, while longer ones will stick on, building up selective stockpiles of maybe better preferential RNA or other polymers for prebiotic reactions. The question is, but how do you get that RNA back off from that mineral surface? So a lot of researchers, they look at changing pH, because generally if you make a system more alkaline, you can release those those RNA strands or polymer strands from the RNA. And this is a little experiment that I've done with some researchers in our lab for montmorillonite. You can see really quite clearly from a low pH from around 4 up to 10 or 11, everything sticks incredibly strongly to that montmorillonite. The RNA you put in there is absorbed on very tightly, hard to release. But when you go up to a pH of 12, it'll all come back off. However, we still don't know how many other minerals can be affected by this. So maybe different minerals may be more absorbent at high pHs, may have different sort of gradients, which would add more complexity. Minerals can also add complexity temporally, so across time. As you can see here, we can start with a bit of RNA absorbed onto a mineral surface. We have some Dresser pillar basalts, a bit of kaolinite minerals, and some montmorillonite. And when you change the pH up to 11, the minerals release that RNA over different timescales. So you can see the montmorillonite's a lot more slower release, where that pillar basalt, the kaolinite, almost dumps it back into solution all at once. So if you're looking for a prebiotic reaction that you need a slow release over time or continued input of a certain material, maybe mineral grains can have that release. So these are just, demonstrations of the functionality of these hot spring systems. We want to test it. So we're starting to recreate prebiotic experiments, prebiotic systems in these messy chemical conditions to see if they can replicate what happens and even promote some reactions. So yeah, if you're doing any experiments and you want to do it in a realistic environment, please get in contact with us and let us know. The next phase of our research is all around vesicles. So as Bruce mentioned, that vesicles are really important for encapsulating RNA and protecting that. As you can see here, they can, do molecular crowding to get all of your RNA floating around, cramming in together to promote a reaction. You can also have individuals forming. So as you're different individuals of vesicles, they can start to compete. Maybe one has different polymers inside it that will make it live on longer through a stress and will survive to the next round. Vesicles protect them from viruses or free-loading RNA that wants to get in there. So the little face marks over your RNA. Fatty acids are a common form of vesicles because they're prebiotically viable, but they need to have the right pH. If fatty acids are too acidic or too alkaline, they can clump up and won't form these beautiful spontaneous structures. So you can put a bunch of RNA and fatty acids into a beaker, and if you dry that down, Dave and Bruce have shown that you form those layers that encapsulate the RNA in between them. And as you rehydrate, they can bud off and encapsulate that RNA to form these crowded molecules. So Anna Wang and I wanted to explore that a bit more to see what was going on here. So we put some decanoic acid, a fatty acid, with some RNA and a PBS buffer to keep the pH in the right area, around 7.4. And we showed that we'll dry it down for an hour. And when we rehydrate it, we can see that not only do we get these nice vesicles forming here, but we get these glowing dots that are very highly concentrated RNA. The thing that was interesting and new from these results was that it's selectively incorporated in these very thin-walled vesicles. You can see in all the pictures along the top, you have these big onions of multiple layers and really thick ones. It was only these incredibly thin-walled vesicles that were encapsulating that RNA, which is a preferential selective pressure for vesicles that may be more looking like cells, these more thinner-walled, uniform vesicles. We did other experiments. Instead of putting in a buffer to keep the pH at 7.4, we just put in a bit of salt so the pH dropped down to 5.5, which normally wouldn't form vesicles. So you can see here before it dry down, you get these, in the top left-hand picture, you get these big kind of clumps of RNA, but not actually forming these nice vesicles. But by drying that down and rehydrating it, we're actually seeing all these vesicles spontaneously form that are also encapsulating that RNA. One way this may be happening is that you can see you have these clumps in the pre-dry down with the wrong pH, they're all clumped together. But as you dry down, you can sort of stack those layers into nice sheets and you're kind of priming them. So when you rehydrate, they can actually bud up and form these nice vesicles. So what does that have to do with the origin of life? So we're showing that wet-dry systems, not only are they good for polymerizing RNA, but they can also create favorably structured thin-walled vesicles that preferentially encapsulate RNA over more clumpier, bigger onion vesicles. We've also shown at pHs lower than the pH needed to spontaneously form vesicles, you can still form them because this wet-dry cycling can remodel these dense lipid bundles to form these nice thin-walled vesicles capable of encapsulating RNA. And we also showed that these systems are robust, you know, you can do them in quite salty conditions, you can do them at lower pHs, and you can heat them up for a long period of time, over an hour at 90 degrees Celsius, and they can still form these bundles. So in a potentially prebiotic environment, they may be able to survive. So overall, hot spring systems, they're incredibly, immensely complex. They have geological, chemical, and temporal complexity, which could be very important for driving these prebiotic reactions. They also have the physical process of making those lipid vesicles more prebiotically preferential, making them more shaped nicely to encapsulate RNA. And also it's really highlighted the importance of getting out into the field, that if you want to be recreating the origin of life, no matter what environment you think it formed in, go out there and study that field, look at the geology, look at the chemistry and see how it all forms. So I think I'm just hitting time now. So thank you all so much for that. And I really appreciate you listening to my talk.
Great. Thanks, Luke. Thanks a lot for that. We are right on time, so lots of comments in the chat room there, Luke, for you to address. Many good questions, and I think what this highlights is that there's still lots of room for innovative testing, really thinking about what Mary Voytek had brought up, the importance of context. And Luke touched very briefly on that, sort of the glass tube versus the messy chemistry and the complexity of hot springs. How do we rationalize, you know, polymers in a wet environment and controlling wet-dry cycles, all that rest. It's a really fruitful topic for continued research. So the great thing is that there's lots of opportunities left in that field. So yeah, Luke, I think you'll have to go and address those questions in the chat room, and we'll move on to the last talk for the morning by Manesh Joshi and his colleagues about the formation and stability of prebiotic vesicular systems in terrestrial geothermal environments. This is from the group at the Indian Institute of Science and Education and Research at Pune, India. And we have the invited talk by the leader of that group, Sudha Rajamani, later on this afternoon. So Manesh, if you're up, please turn on your mic and we can start to get the slides. Thanks very much, looks good. Can you say a couple of words?
Yeah, sure. Martin, am I audible?
You are audible, you're quite quiet though. I don't know if you can get closer to your microphone.
Okay, I'll try to speak loud, maybe.
That's better. Great. Okay, floor is yours.
Cool. Okay. Thank you so much for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. It's 7:15 here in India. So my name is Manesh. I am a PhD student in in Chemical Origins of Life lab in IISER Pune in India. And today I'm going to talk about the formation and stability of prebiotically plausible vesicles under buffered versus analog conditions in the context of terrestrial hot springs. So as the theme of this session suggests, that terrestrial hot springs are considered as one of the plausible niches where life on Earth might have originated. This is mainly because of the different interesting features of these hot springs, like their low ionic strength, high temperature, and the cycles of dehydration and rehydration. These processes are thought to have facilitated some of the important processes required for protocell formation, like membrane assembly from simple amphiphils, then non-enzymatic oligomerization, and the subsequent encapsulation of these oligomers into membranes to form a protocell-like structures. So the way researchers actually understand these processes is they simulate these hot spring-like conditions in the laboratory and then try to understand these reactions. But there is a catch here, that the laboratory simulations of these prebiotic conditions, they are often done with purified water. There is the addition of external component to maintain the buffer, to buffer the pH of the solution, and also addition of pure reagents. So this raises an important question, that whether the results that we get from laboratory simulations, will they also hold under prebiotic analog environments, which gives a more natural or realistic sense of these processes. So these hot springs are mainly discussed in the context of extremophiles, or let's say from a geology point of view. What I'm going to discuss is I'm going to look it from a biochemistry point of view. So to address this question, we actually participated in an expedition conducted by NASA as a part of NASA Spaceward Bound program to a remote region of India called as Ladakh. So it's an astrobiologically relevant site which has many topological features which are analogous to the Martian and early Earth conditions. So there are different hot springs in this Ladakh called as Puga, Chumatang, and Panamik. So all these are alkaline hot springs having pH around 8 to 9. So we collected these samples from hot springs and brought them to the laboratory. So in order to avoid the interference, human interference and microbial contamination, we collected these hot springs specifically from the origin site, and also filtered them through 200 nanometer syringe filter in order to get rid of the microorganisms. And then we use these samples to study one of the important processes in protocell formation, that is the formation of membrane compartments from fatty acids. So why fatty acids? As discussed in previous talks, their obvious prebiotic relevance, and also they can readily form vesicles at alkaline pH. And this is how they look under microscope, the bottom right part of my slide. However, it has been shown that the pure fatty acid vesicles are susceptible to the changes in the environment, like a change in pH, temperature, or ionic strength. However, the addition of surfactant actually increases the robustness of these vesicles. That's why we started with the one of the extensively studied fatty acid systems, like oleic acid and its alcohol and glycerol derivative. And we tried different combinations of these mixed fatty acid vesicles to test their formation under buffered versus analog condition. So as a laboratory buffer control, we used Bison buffer pH 8.5 to compare it with the pH of the hot spring sample that we are looking at. So as you can see, all the combinations of oleic acid and its derivative were able to form vesicles in Bison buffer. However, when we tested these combinations in Puga hot springs, we actually noticed that only a combination of oleic acid and its glycerol derivative was able to assemble into vesicles. Rest of the combinations either didn't form vesicles or they phase separated as shiny oil droplets from the system. So the similar results were also observed with other hot spring water samples. However, while doing the microscopy, we noticed that the number of vesicles that were formed in these hot springs were seemingly more in Puga hot spring as compared to Chumatang and Panamik. So we suspected that maybe the varying ionic strength of these hot springs might be playing some role here. That's why we performed a geochemical analysis of these hot springs, and you can see there are different cations and anions present in varying concentration, which actually provides a beautiful natural backdrop to study this membrane assembly processes. And if you notice the overall ionic strength of these hot springs, so they follow this order from Puga to Chumatang to Panamik. And if you compare it with the vesicle formation results, we could say that there might be certain minimum ionic strength which is required for the formation of fatty acid vesicles. I'm going to discuss this more in a later part of my presentation. So we also conducted some of the experiments with lower chain fatty acids given their prebiotic abundance, and the results were quite comparable with the oleic acid system. And as you can see from this summary table, a combination of fatty acid and glycerol derivative was a clear winner, which actually could form vesicles in all the hot spring samples, irrespective of the fatty acid chain length and saturation. So we took these winner combinations to perform our next set of experiments, where we looked at their vesicle forming propensity under DHRS conditions. As extensively discussed in the previous talk by Dr. Bruce Demer and Luke, the importance of this DHRS cycles in the context of origins of life. So we were trying to looking at how the vesicle forming propensity of these systems behave under DHRS conditions. So we noticed that in buffered conditions, the number of vesicles were quite comparable even after multiple wet dry cycles. However, in hot spring sample, the number of vesicles kind of decreased with increasing DHRS cycles. We suspect that the actually chemical stability of these fatty acids might be playing some role here. So the results that I have discussed so far, you can find it in the paper that I have mentioned in the bottom. So clearly the ionic strength of this hot spring was really playing a major role in the prebiotic membrane assembly processes. Therefore, we set out to investigate this in a greater detail. So as you can see, there are many studies which talk about the inhibitory effect of high salt concentration on fatty acid vesicles. However, there are very few studies which actually talk about the importance of ionic strength for vesicle formation. There were a few papers from Dr. Sarah Muir's group where they talk about the where they mention that there is a certain minimum threshold of ionic strength which is required for fatty acid membrane assembly. Also, they pointed out that we often tend to neglect the addition of salt during the vesicle formation process. Maybe it's a rehydration by buffer, where we tend to adjust buffer with NaOH or HCl, or maybe it's a vesicle formation by a titration method. So invariably we add some salt to it to begin with. In this context, actually hot spring provide a very potential system to study the role of this ionic strength on membrane assembly process. Because of their low ionic strength, you can systematically increase the concentration of one of the ions by externally adding it to the sample, and then see how it affects the membrane assembly process. For this, we used a Panamik hot spring sample because it was one of the lowest ionic, it has one of the lowest ionic strength of the hot spring samples that we had. And while after performing these experiments, we noticed that it's not only the ionic strength, but temperature also plays an important role for these membrane assembly processes. As you can see from this section, that when we both externally add salt to the solution, as well as did a prolonged heating of the reaction mixtures, we could dramatically see the change in the behavior of these systems, where now all the combinations of acid and its derivative were able to form vesicles even in hot spring samples. So to summarize the results that I have discussed so far, we observed that a mixture of fatty acid and its glycerol derivative was the most robust system, which could form vesicles in all the hot spring samples that we studied. And important to note that the similar results were also observed in one of the recent studies from Dr. David Deemer's group, where they studied fatty acid assembly in hot spring samples collected from Yellowstone National Park. So this kind of indicates the generality of the results that we have obtained. And this also has an implications from the evolution of prebiotic membranes, because as you can see that this monoglycerol derivative stabilizes the fatty acid vesicles even under hot spring conditions. And also the glycerol derivative is considered as one of the intermediate steps from fatty acids to phospholipid vesicles. So these complex conditions, natural conditions, could act as a selection pressure for the evolution of more chemically complex or the more heterogeneous systems. Overall, the vesicle forming propensity of these mixed systems were found to be decreasing with increasing DHRS cycles in hot spring water. And we found that both the temperature and ionic strength play a major role in the prebiotic membrane assembly processes. So overall, our work highlights the importance of studying the prebiotically plausible reactions under earlier analog conditions. But when we say that, it does not undermine the importance of laboratory simulations of prebiotic processes or the earlier conditions. However, we strongly believe that both these approaches should be taken in a concerted fashion in order to get more implications or understanding of these complex prebiotic processes. So in our lab, we take this holistic approach to study prebiotic reactions, and Sudha is going to talk more about it in a next session. Currently, I am trying to understand the dynamic interplay between membrane assembly and peptide synthesis under terrestrial hot spring-like conditions, and we are soon going to publish those results. So I thank organizers for giving me the opportunity to present my work, my guide Dr. Sudha Rajmani, my lab people, institute, and the funding agency. If you want to know more about our research or want to initiate research collaborations, you can always contact us. I thank you all for attending my presentation, and will be happy to take questions if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manesh. Really nice to hear about that work. It's great to see that a number of labs around the world are starting to converge on the same kind of testing of some of these theoretical ideas. So listen, it's 12 o'clock, so we're right on time for the start of our break. So again, I think we'll have to leave the questions to the chat room. Manesh, do you want to just stop sharing your screen, please?
Sure.
Even though that's one of the most beautiful pictures of a hot spring that you can find, I think. That beautifully iced up mouth of one of the boratic hot springs in Puga. So yes, we'll take a break there and come back at 12:30 for our first look at modern analogs for primitive life. Thank you all for attending, and we'll see you in half an hour.